So, welcome participants to yet another session on communication. We have already discussed with you the process of communication, and we talked about the two key elements, that is the sender and the receiver, and then we also talked about the channel, and we noted that each of these stages could have potential barriers also. So today we shall elaborate some of the barriers that we may encounter during this communication process. Some of the barriers we noted when we were discussing the process, like for example, we talked about noise, and we talked about both physical noise and the psychological noise. So all those things, including the barriers which arise at the level of the sender and the receiver and the medium, we will discuss each of these barriers today. So actually the first important barrier of our communication is that we have differing perceptions. Actually, senders and receivers, they are two different individuals. So we have to keep into account this factor, that sender and receiver, they are two different individuals. So when they communicate, then these are two different persons who are communicating, and they come with their own unique set of experiences and expectations. So because these perceptions differ, there is likely to be a kind of mismatch between these two people. In fact, there is a saying which goes like this, that we don't see things the way they are, we see things the way we are. So our previous background, our experiences that we have had, they influence our perceptions, and that impacts our communication also. You may recall that when we were discussing issues related with decision making, we have talked about a model of decision making which we call the heuristics based model of decision making. And we noted in that heuristics are the shortcuts that we employ, and we also discussed the factors that influence our heuristics. So for example, one of the factors was past experiences. So, and in that also we discussed that both the recentness of the experience as also the vividness of the experience impact our communication. So for example, people who had witnessed the trauma of partition, for example, it's a very vivid experience, and many of them were not able to come out of it. Likewise, so all their future actions were influenced by that trauma that they experienced. And likewise, we discussed some other events also, like for example, the devastating earthquake that we had in Gujarat in early 2000. So people who had experienced those kind of traumas, the heuristics are guided by that, isn't it? So for example, let me quote a specific occasion how these heuristics may impact. For example, suppose you have an architect who had experienced that tragedy. So whenever he would design buildings in future, he would keep an extra safety margin, more than the required safety margin in the buildings. So he may go for higher quantity of a steel, for example, and may say that actually we have to ensure that if such events occur, they do not damage the building completely. So past experiences, they guide our heuristics, and they shape our communication receptivity also, isn't it? So all those communications which are in line with our past experiences are likely to be received better by us than the new thing that we are introducing in our communication. Then one more thing which we noted, which guides our heuristics, is what we call representativeness. Now, what is this representativeness? Actually, we make judgments about various classes. So for example, gender is one, we make our own inferences. And I discussed with you this example that there is a perception that prevails that girls, for example, cannot study mathematics as well as boys can do. Now, this perception it may have no basis, but suppose if this perception prevails, so what do we do then? Suppose we have to decide about the career of a family member who happens to be a girl, and we would say that by and large girls don't have an aptitude for mathematics. So we guide them towards other career options. So without making a honest and objective assessment about the person's capability, we just go by the class to which that person belongs. Sometimes it could be a positive perception also. For example, I may believe that girls are more trustworthy. So suppose as a teacher, if I have to decide this issue that whether I should lend my book or not, now my decision is guided by this. Okay, if it happens to be a girl and they are more trustworthy, so I can lend my book to a girl but not to a boy. So it could be both positive, it could have negative fallouts also. And then I also talked about this factor which is called anchoring. Again, this is also our past experience only. We have certain anchors which actually guide our thought process. So, for example, I gave you an example of architect's fee, for example. There is an industry norm that the range may be between, let us say, 2% to 4%. So, I use that as an anchor, and that becomes my basis of decision making. So, if there is an architect who is actually very good and he may bring us a lot of savings, and he tries to impress upon this point to us that don't focus on my cost per se, because I am going to bring to you a lot of savings through efficient design, but I will continue to be guided by my past heuristics that a architect should charge in the range of 2 to 4%. So I often discount the new evidence that is being brought to me. The architect may say that I have designed these buildings and this was the original cost estimate, but I have brought it down because of my efficient design. So when our heuristics are taken to an extreme, we have already pointed out how they can become actually traps for us. So our communication is also impacted by these traps, which take the shape of heuristics. In fact, I have already discussed with you this famous story of 6 visually challenged persons, and they went out to explore what an elephant is like, and all their perceptions were actually guided by the part of the elephant which they touched physically. So somebody who touched the body said elephant looks like a wall. Somebody who touched the legs said actually it is like the trunk of a tree. Somebody who touched the tail, he said no, it is like a rope. So in fact, somebody who touched the ear said it is more like a fan. So is it so that they are incorrect? No, they are not incorrect, they are incomplete. So we, all of us, as far as our perceptions are concerned, we are incomplete because we have seen the world from our own angle. So any communication that fits into that angle, we somehow treat that as the right communication, and rest of the communication we actually end up ignoring. Now let us come to the second category of barriers, which we call the language related barriers or linguistic barriers. In fact, they are also closely linked to individual perceptions. Language actually shapes our perceptions very significantly. So for example, in India, one of the major element of our cultural characteristic is our linguistic diversity that we have. In fact, the 29, 30 odd it says that we have, they represent a nation in themselves, isn't it? Why? Because the unique socio-cultural profile of that particular state is guided by the language which is prevalent in that state. So our perceptions are shaped by this very important socio-cultural dimension. So then there is another problem, even if we are using the same language, for example. For example, suppose all of us are well conversant in English, but we may have difference of opinion regarding interpretation of some of the words. For example, let us say there is a memo, official memo issued by the company that we intend to develop a new product in a short time. Now, how this short time would be interpreted by different functional groups in the organization? Will they interpret it in the same manner? So, for a salesperson, for example, or for a marketing person, that short span may be just within a fortnight or within a month. For a finance person, that span may be slightly higher, maybe 2 months or 3 months. And for the strategy group or the R&D group, they may say that actually short time means it would be 3 years or 2 years, because that is the time that they require for developing new products. So even this term short time, although everybody would understand the literal meaning of it, but might interpret it very differently, isn't it? So these variations, both in terms of our understanding of the words of a particular language, as also the linguistic diversities that we have, they impact our communication and they become a major barrier. Especially, in organizations which have a factory setup, this becomes extremely important, because generally in the factory setup we have people who are at the lower rung of the hierarchy and they speak in the local language. The managers who are there for managing the affairs, they generally use the language, or they are well conversant in the language which is used by the corporate office. So maybe if for the world of business, English is the medium of instructions and communication and exchange of ideas. So the communication between the headquarters and people who are in charge of the activities, the managerial class in the factory setups, they may communicate well, but those managers who are managing the factories, will they be able to communicate with equal felicity with the workers group who are conversing basically in the local language, isn't it? So this is a huge challenge in view of the linguistic differences that we have in our country. Then there is a very serious technical problem that we encounter, which is a language barrier, which is what we call the jargon infested language. Actually, every specialty has its own jargons. For example, for a doctor, if we take a patient to him and the person is having a heart problem, for example, the doctor would say that he is having a MI attack. Now, myocardial infection may be a kind of very approved term for the doctor's fraternity, but how it would be viewed by the general class? So likewise, there is a very serious problem which is there with all professionals, be it lawyers, be it managers who have been trained formally, they have done a formal academic course in management. So there is a charge against all these groups that they tend to converse in a language which is very, very unique to their own profession, but the general class of people are not well conversant. So, for example, a marketing manager who has recently attended a course, management development course, and he may start using very high sounding kind of words, like for example, we have to go for a marketing skimming strategy. Now, marketing skimming strategy may come to him very naturally because of his academic background, but how many team members are likely to accept that kind of terminology? So, this creates another very unique barrier in communication, that we tend to speak in a specialist's language. Let me share it with you that I have been a trainer for young faculty members who come to attend their faculty development programs, which are actually mandatory for the young teachers to get promotion. And I have noted this as a major problem, that when they are in a heterogeneous group, because these people who come for faculty development program, they belong to various disciplines, and when they make presentations, only few of them are able to bring that to the level of the audience. And most of the time in science-based presentations or in engineering-based presentations or even in medicine or dentistry, the teachers end up using a terminology which is not understandable by the larger group of the teachers. So, when we are in a homogeneous group, it might not be a problem, but when we are in a heterogeneous group and we use technical language or jargon oriented language, it might actually be creating a language or linguistic barrier in our communication. Now, let us come to the third barrier, which we call noise. Now, what is noise actually? Noise is any factor that disturbs or confuses or overall interferes with our communication. And in the previous session, I talked about two types of noises, the physical one and the psychological one. And today I will add a few more to this, but primarily actually these are the two types of noises that we experience, the physical one and the psychological one. So, for example, physical noise would be like distractions, all kind of physical distractions. For example, suppose I am recording this lecture and there is a humming sound of the air conditioner. Now, even that may come as a noise, but it's a physical noise. Or there may be poor acoustics in this room, or there may be some other distractions also, like for example, somebody may just barge into the room and that will disturb my communication. So, in organizations, actually there are disturbances of this type. For example, in factory setup, there are humming sounds of the machines and it becomes very difficult to communicate. So, the noise also, the physical noise actually could be a barrier to communication, but more important is the psychological noise, which is linked with our previous point that we have made, the perceptual barriers. So, one is our overall trait. So, for example, I may be pessimistic in nature. So, that is my state or my general trait. But sometimes we undergo variations in our mental states. Sometimes we are feeling high, sometimes we are feeling low, isn't it? So, actually all that also impacts our communication. So, when we are preoccupied with a pressing problem and a friend comes and shares with us a kind of good news and he wants that we should acknowledge it and we should also feel happy, but because we are already preoccupied with our own issues and problems, we ignore that kind of thing, and the other person may feel bad about it. I have also talked about the biases that we carry or the prejudices that we carry, which are based because of which are based on our past experiences. So that also creates a psychological noise. And there may be physiological noise also. Like for example, some of us may not be that blessed in terms of the sensory organs that we have. Somebody may have hearing impairment, for example. Somebody may be under physical pain for one reason or the other, isn't it? Or somebody may be very tired. So all those, physiological states also creates a kind of noise in our communication. Then there is another kind of noise which we call the semantic noise. And we have already elaborated this idea earlier. So differences in the language base that we have, or the technical vocabulary of our profession, or even understanding of the words. I've already talked about it, like short time. Now short time may be interpreted. In fact, when a Japanese was asked about long term, and he said, what is the span of the long term in your country? And he said, it is 5 minutes. So everybody was amazed. He said, actually, the world is now so volatile that you can't predict for 5 years, 3 years. It is so short a period now. So we presume long term to mean, let us say, 5 years and above. But for him, it was a very short period. It may be an extreme example, but I am highlighting how our understanding of words and concepts may be at variance with the other person with whom we are communicating. Now comes the fourth barrier, which we call emotional filters. This is a very important barrier. We are under different kind of emotional states. Some of these states may be positive. For example, the feelings of love or affection or pride. So for example, I may have a lot of pride in my association with my university, is it? Or, I may have a particular affection for my student or a special student who has come up in life in the hard way. So what happens? Our communication is impacted by our positive emotional states. But the challenge is that our negative emotional states also impact our communication adversely. So what are those negative emotional states? They could be states like anger. I am feeling angry because of some reason, or I hate a particular group, for example. And we have linguistics as also caste related diversities in this country, and actually we make stereotypes, and because of this we may have an adversarial relations with some groups, isn't it? Then it could also be a general feeling of jealousy, or when we feel let us say somebody is coming up in life and we are not able to come up to that level, so we become jealous. We may not show it, but deep down that resentment is there. So any communication from that person will be impacted by that feeling of jealousy that I have for that person. So both positive as also negative states, they decide how a communication is viewed. Now in this respect, I wish to mention one factor which has been highlighted by Aristotle as a very important factor which impacts our persuasiveness in communication, which he calls pathos. What is a pathos? Actually, pathos is an appeal to the emotions. And we use pathos to persuade the listener to accept our communication in a particular way. Now again, this could be positive, but this could also be negative. We have had fanatics in the world who have aroused emotions against other groups, isn't it? And it had led to disastrous results also, isn't it? We have had concentration camps just because, one group was incited against another group. So pathos has its positive side, but it also has a negative side. And it has been extensively used in literature, in politics, in advertising, as also in our personal conversations. For example, in advertising, you have a baby product. So you would try to create the emotions of love that mother has for the child. And we have many such ads where those emotions are actually exploited to promote the sale of a particular baby product. So you say that if the mother loves the baby, the mother would offer this kind of oil massage to the baby, or this kind of food for the baby. In politics also, we have seen how this has been used. One of the famous speeches is of Martin Luther King, who was fighting for the rights of the black Americans. And one of his famous speeches where he said that I dream of this country as one where my 4 little children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of the character. Or likewise, Pandit Nehru's speech at the dawn of India's independence, when he said, when world sleeps, India awakes, and our tirist with the destiny begins. So arouses emotions, isn't it? But as I said, the overuse of it, or actually its use by demagogues, could result in negative fallouts also. It has been used in literature also, isn't it? Extensively used in literature, because literature tends to arouse feelings. It is not just logic, it is feelings, the emotions through which we create powerful literature. I recall the play that Shakespeare wrote, Julius Caesar, and is one character called Mark Antony. And this expression has become now a very popular expression, where he would deliver a speech when the funeral ceremony of Brutus is going on, and he makes this plea during the speech that Brutus is actually is an honorable man, and he repeats it number of times. Brutus is an honorable man. And it was a particularly impactful line. But actually there was a devious purpose that Antony has. Apparently he was saying that Brutus is an honorable man, but through series of dialogues he wanted to impress upon this point that actually Brutus was not that honorable man. Isn't it? So it could be used in a very devious way also. That is my point that I wish to highlight. So emotional filters we all have, whether we accept it or not, and that impacts our communication. It could act as a barrier to our communication. Now then, there is a fifth dimension which we call our inconsistent verbal and non-verbal communication. Actually, only a part of our communication is verbal, the rest is non-verbal. And in fact, a major part of it is non-verbal. Almost the researchers have pointed out that 65% of it is non-verbal. Now, what is included in the non-verbal communication? Like eye contact, which is technically called oculesics. Then body language as a whole, like for example, I'm using my hands, so this is kinesics. Then the social distance also plays a very important role. In every culture it might be different. For example, I have a personal space of, let us say, 3 feet. So only dear ones, my close family members, can come in that social distance. So if somebody is actually trying to come near me and actually trying to get into my personal space without the person saying a word, actually the person is communicating, isn't it? So social distances, there are approved social distances, the private space, the public space. So they also impact our communication. Then a very powerful non-verbal communication is what is called touch, the haptics part of it. I recall a film, I remember the name as Shakti perhaps, in which one of the two legendary actors, one Dilip Kumar and another Amitabh Bachchan, they were there. And it was a father-son relationship, and they had a very strange relations all through. That is what is depicted in the film. And when the mother dies, both meet on that occasion. And because they had strange relations, they don't utter a word. But the son comes and just puts his hand on the father. So the communication has taken place actually. So touch actually is a very important non-verbal communication. Yes, voice also. Voice, we actually vary the pace. We sometimes speak louder. Then all those things, if I want to lay stress on a point, I will come near you, for example, and I will raise the pitch of my voice. So those intonations that we have, the variations, the pitch and the pace that we have, that also is a part of non-verbal communication. Then physical appearances and objects, for example, jewelry for girls, that may also communicate something. So what kind of jewelry do we wear when we go to office? Vis-a-vis the jewelry we wear when we go to a social function. So all that actually impacts our communication. Then continuing with those emotional filters I talked about, there is this factor of distrust. And Aristotle, whose ideas I discussed, pathos, he talks about another factor called ethos. What is the trustworthiness or credibility of the person who is communicating? If the person is reliable, has the necessary expertise, there would be trust. Otherwise, there would be distrust, isn't it? So this also could act as a barrier when we do not have sufficient faith on the credibility of the person who is communicating. So if that distrust prevails, it would act as a barrier. Now the last barrier, which is a very important barrier, is what we call information overload. This has become extremely important in the present day world. Now information is the basis of communication, but it is not the whole of communication. So information and communication are different, yet they have a link also. This is the challenge, isn't it? So what is the present day issue that we are faced with? We are all, overloaded with information, not communication. Because more information doesn't mean more communication. So we all have this, experience that we are flooded with emails, messages, notifications, social media updates and all that. So when we have more information, there is less communication. It is like, a child who is sent to a candy store and there are so many candies and he, wants to grab everything. But you can't do that actually. If we overeat, it will spoil our health, isn't it? So actually the earlier challenge in communication was that we were called upon to distill information from the communication. So if you are reading a historical event and you are reading what has happened in the national freedom struggle, for example, you try to get relevant information out of that narration. But now the challenge has reversed. Now we have so much of information, and drawing communication out of it, distilling communication out of it, is actually one of the challenging propositions. In fact, the issue is best captured in this proverb that we have, missing woods for the forest. So just by counting trees, we can't understand the reality of the forest. Forest is much bigger than the number of trees in it, isn't it? But because there are so many trees, meaning thereby so much of information, we get lost in making sense of that information, and there is less of communication. So how can we overcome these barriers? Let me spend some time on it, although we will have a detailed discussion on it in the next class that we have. But you can understand that when we have differing perceptions, empathy is the core. Our ability to get into the shoes of the other person. And for that, we may have to allow our judgments to wait. So if we learn to, postpone our judgments, we can address this issue of differing perceptions. Linguistics barriers, I will spend a substantial amount of time on it. How can we actually address these linguistics barriers by focusing on 7 C's of effective communication? I'll talk about it. The noise, physical noise we can handle actually, but more important is the psychological noise, and we will talk about this also in the later part. Emotional filters, I have already said, if we are in heightened emotional state, we should not, make judgments in that heightened emotional state. So we have to postpone our judgments, and only when we are level-headed, then we have to make a judgment about other person's communication. Then inconsistency between verbal and non-verbal, I have discussed this. Overcoming distrust is also something which we will address. And actually, for the last point, information overload, I'll suggest an option which is called digital fasting. So if we can be away from our electronic gadgets for some period of time, actually this could be a great help to overcome this information overload that we have. Then there is a approach which we call the approach of redundancy, that is, we repeat or restate the message. I have been using it in my lectures often. If I cover a point, in the end, I repeat that point. But here also there is a problem. If we overdo it, it could actually be detrimental, isn't it? So we will have detailed discussion on these issues when we talk about the 7 C's of effective communication. So for the moment, I think this would suffice. Thank you very much. So dear participants of this program, we have in the previous session talked about various barriers to communication, and we have had some discussion on the ways of addressing those barriers. So today in this session, we wish to extend that discussion further and talk about various C's. If we focus on those C's, we can overcome some of those barriers which we encounter in the communication. So today's discussion, you may have to look in the light of the preliminary discussion that we have had on ways of addressing the barriers in communication. Now, what are these 7 the C's of effective communication? Actually, there is a background which I may share with you, that these 7 C's were proposed by an author called Francis J. Berghin, and he initially proposed 7 C's, but over the years I have also been experimenting with these 7 C's, and especially there is a write-up which I ask my students to write, or in my training programs also I have used this instrument very frequently, and I ask them to gain better self-awareness about themselves through this write-up, who am I. So it actually helps me assess the personality, but more importantly, it helps me assess the intrapersonal communication, the communication which is taking place within the person, isn't it? So I think this is also a point which we have to keep into account, that actually the first communication begins within the person, isn't it? So if that communication is clear, the external communication, the interpersonal communication, which we have been focusing in the last two turns, would also be very effective. So in this context, I have been using this instrument, and when I assess the communication of my participants or my students, the original C's that were proposed by Francis J. Bergin, they got expanded further, and now we have some additional C's which I will discuss with you in this session. And in the light of this, we will share with you some tips for our effective communication. So let us come to the original 7 C's that were proposed by Francis, and these 7 C's were completeness, conciseness, clarity, correctness, concreteness, consideration, and finally courtesy. So these were the 7 C's which were proposed, and let us see how they help us overcome the barriers in interpersonal communication. So what we will do in this session, we will take up these C's one by one. We shall share with you some real life examples through which you can assess your own communication. Okay, whether we have been intuitively following these C's in our communication or not. If we are not, then if we want to overcome the barriers, we may actually have to address these C's that are there. Now let us take up each one of them one by one and see what do they mean. So what is actually completeness in communication? Completeness means that we provide all the needed information and facts in our communication. Like for example, I talked about this instrument that I have been using, Who Am I? And I ask my students or my trainees to write 4 aspects, cover 4 aspects in this write-up, that is their background, then how do they see themselves as a person, then key achievements they have had in their life, and then what is their aim in life finally, isn't it? So these are the sub-dimensions of this. In fact, there are some further splitting of the dimensions. For example, in the background, I request them to talk about both their academic or educational background as also the social background. Likewise, when I ask them to specify their aim in life, I exhort them to cover their career as also life goals, isn't it? So this briefing is done to them, and my experience has been that despite my briefing, not all participants cover all the dimensions. For example, when they are describing themselves as a person, I ask them to talk about their strengths as also their weaknesses. So generally they talk more about their strengths and they talk less about their weaknesses. Some of them will not talk about their weaknesses. Then it is very difficult for them to write the aim in life also. So even if they write, they will just write about their career aspirations, nothing about the aim. So what is a complete communication? If I am expecting 4 dimensions to be covered and also the sub-dimensions to be covered, any communication which covers all those dimensions would be a complete communication for me. So it helps the receiver understand the sender fully. So for example, if I am taking a hiring decision and I get complete information, I can make a better hiring decision if I know the person fully, both the strengths as also the weaknesses, and then I have this idea what would be the job demands. So I can make a better match between the job demands and the person's profile. So completeness refers to this dimension of communication, that we should be able to provide all the required facts and information. So when we look at it from this perspective, we can use some other C's also which communicate the same idea. That is, our communication should be content rich and comprehensive. I give you an example of comprehensive. For example, suppose you want to improve the performance of Indian cricket team and you want to prepare a strategy. A comprehensive strategy would be one which covers all the dimensions of the game. For example, bowling, batting, as also fielding. So if your strategy covers bowling and batting and not fielding, your strategy is not comprehensive. Likewise, our communication is not comprehensive if we have not covered all the required dimensions, is it? Now, content rich, what does that say? It says that actually there is a continuum on this account also. On one account, there is heaviness, and on another account, it is light. So, our communication should be somewhere in between. Rich, but not heavy. Likewise, rich and not too light that it doesn't communicate the required information. So, that is completeness in communication. Now, the other C is what is called conciseness. Now, what is conciseness actually? Put very simply, it means we talk less but we say more. There is a colloquial expression for it which we say gagar mein sagar bharna, isn't it? So, when we are able to use few words yet communicate our ideas profoundly, we are precise and concise in our communication. Now, why this factor has assumed importance in communication these days? Actually, with this arrival of information overload which I talked about, the attention span and overexposure to the social media, actually people's attention span has gone down. So, it becomes very difficult to concentrate for a long period of time. So, in this era of reels, if we have a long speech, how many of the listeners will be interested in that kind of a speech? So, we have to economize on words because that saves time as also the cost. Now, let us also understand why this C is compromised in our interpersonal communication. One is we are unable to distinguish between data and information. In fact, something may be an information for you, but may be a data for me. For example, I want to know a person's social background, and I request him that, okay, share about your family background. And the person starts narrating the name of his father or name of his mother or name of his brothers and sisters and all. Now, am I interested in that? Yes, the name of your mother or name of your father may be information for you, but for me it is only a data, because I am interested in understanding you, and that kind of data doesn't help me understand you as a person. So, I may not be interested in that, isn't it? So, actually what may sound as information to the sender may just be a data to the receiver. Now, why this happens? Again, that issue of empathy we talked about. We are unable to look at things from listener's perspective. So, if I am asking you, please describe your family details, you should be able to understand what are the details I am looking forward to. Maybe I am looking forward to listen to what kind of orientation a family has. Is it a service oriented family, or it's a business oriented family, or those kind of things I am interested in, isn't it? Not the names of the family members, isn't it? So, what is the way out, and how can we improve the preciseness or conciseness of our communication? And is there an ideal length? Actually, this is a very subjective issue, but I may share with you a thumb rule which you can follow, which is less is more. So, it is better to err on the side of caution, isn't it? say less and then try to assess whether the receiver wants more. Then only share additional information. So normally in interview situations, for example, suppose you go for a job interview and a question is asked, don't lengthen your answer beyond 1 minute or 90 seconds, 1.5 minutes, because the panelist's attention span may get wavered here and there, isn't it? So less is more. Please keep this thumb rule in your mind when you want to improve the preciseness of your communication. So there are some alternate C's which communicate the same idea of conciseness, like compact or close packed or compressed, concentrated, condensed, or very crisp communication. All these are actually synonymous words, communicate the same idea of conciseness. Then comes yet another very important C, what we call the clarity. Our communication should be clear. Now, when it would be clear? It would be clear only when it is simple. If I use heavy jargons, will you be able to understand? Like, for example, I used some jargons, proxemics, for example, or kinesics. That's a jargon. But alongside, I used body language, for example. Isn't it? So, if we are able to simplify our communication, then the clarity is there in our communication. In fact, there is a considered opinion on this, that we truly understand an idea, and the test of truly understanding an idea is our ability to explain it simply to others. Now, why this clarity is not there? Actually, there is a level of maturity that we experience when we grow as a person. Initially, we get information. So, for internalizing information, we need memory. Then, when that information is looked in a pattern, that becomes knowledge. For example, suppose we memorize various expressions, scientific expressions or mathematical equations. When we see that in a pattern, that becomes our knowledge base of mathematics. But when we are able to understand why use this particular expression to solve real world problems, that is the stage of wisdom. So, and when we reach to that stage, our ideas are simple but profound. I'll share a few examples how this stage is arrived at. But this is a stage which is arrived at when we explore an issue very deeply and we are able to link that issue with the social context in it. For example, if I have talked about theories of motivation to you, I may have an academic understanding of it. But when I am handling an administrative assignment, and when I apply these theories, how I have to motivate, let us say, this team of 20 odd people which has been entrusted under my custody. So when I apply those theories to motivate my team, I get wisdom on that idea, isn't it? So at that stage, actually, our thinking graduates to simplicity, and that is the level when we attain clarity, isn't it? In fact, I can quote a worthy example at this juncture, that the test of simplicity is the idea becomes simple and we use simple expressions also to communicate that idea. In fact, BBC correspondents are trained on that account. English may have 6 lakhs plus, let us say, words, but they are trained to communicate all their ideas using less than 10,000 words, isn't it? So they are forced to use familiar words, words which are the part of common vocabulary of audiences, isn't it? So that's a that if we are able to incorporate in our thought process this approach, our communication becomes simple. But then why it doesn't happen? Actually, when we get some knowledge, it is like it becomes something like a hammer. And when we get a hammer in our hand, everything looks worth a strike. So often in our communication, we speak to express, not to express, but to impress others. So we use high sounding words, we use technical words. So all these are actually attempts to compromise clarity. I've already talked about how our professional and educational training also impacts our use of vocabulary, isn't it? Especially if we have some very technical words in our vocabulary and we use them indiscriminately, actually the other person may be impressed, but he might not have understood our ideas, isn't it? One more thing which I have noted in my training programs is this mother tongue influence. I talked about the linguistic diversities. Actually, India is a very, very unique country on that account. We may all be speaking English, but the way a Keralite would speak English would be very different from the way a Kashmiri would speak English. So the mother tongue influence also actually comes in the way of clarity of communication, and this is a very serious challenge, this diversity that we have of dialects. Then let me share with you this example which will give you an idea of both clarity at the idea level and clarity at the expression level. This is a real life example. The person writes like this, that I do not find myself to have a specific goal, but this is true that I want to stick to nature's creation and appreciate his creation and try to visualize him, though he is not visible with these eyes, but he forces me to look upon his materialistic world and get truth of life, and somehow I get distracted to the actual aim to achieve. Now the person has used very high sounding words, but do we actually get a sense of the idea? Not really. So why we lack this clarity? Actually, if you look at this communication, the first ambiguity is at the idea level. The person is not very sure what is his core idea. And then the problem gets compounded due to sentence construction also. When you have such long sentences and we try to use conjunction clauses to club two sentences together, that creates additional complexity. So in order to get clarity, we have to first understand the idea in the right earnest, in a very simple manner, and then there is this issue of use of language, effective use of language, use familiar expressions, use simple words, and then if you are able to communicate that idea. In the later part of this session, I'll talk about one such communication which has impressed me very greatly. Very, very profound ideas, but very, very simple words to communicate those ideas. I'll come to that example in the later part. Then there is this issue of correctness of communication, which has two aspects actually. Correctness of facts and information shared, and then the correct use of the language, isn't it? Naturally, it goes without saying that if we fudge information and if we manipulate it, the communication is then not correct, is it? And you know that there have been attempts to fudge information, and that's why fact checking has become one of the business altogether, isn't it? There are so many myths that are being created in the social media these days, isn't it? So Correctness presupposes that we have accurate facts on which we are building our communication. Then the second important issue is correct use of the language. And this relates to appropriate words that we use or grammatically correct expressions that we use. I'll explain each of these ideas one by one to you. I'll have some examples which I pick up again with my experience as a trainer on communication. For example, let us take this communication. Somebody is talking about the family context and says that my mother died in my childhood. Now, this is a clear communication, we understand it. But is it correct? Linguistically, it may be correct also. But we are talking of such a somber event in our life that my mother has passed away. Should I not use such expressions which communicate that sense of loss which one experiences when we lose one of our parents? So there could be alternate expressions like, for example, my mother expired or passed away, or better still, left for her heavenly abode during my childhood. So all these are also simple expressions, but they sound, so it's not just a question of correctness, it's a question of being more correct. I'll share with you a few more examples. For example, somebody writes, in fact, this was a lady teacher who was describing her family context, and she said, I have 2 children. Now, if the same thing could be reworded a bit, I'm blessed with 2 children. Now, you see how the entire expression changes. I'm blessed with. We are expressing a sense of gratitude to the Almighty who has given us that gift, isn't it? So, or like, I like mathematics. Now, we are able to communicate the idea with this also. But that feeling of involvement that should be communicated when we share about a subject which we like, that is not communicated. So, for example, if I use expressions like I enjoy mathematics, or I love mathematics, or I have a passion for maths, better still. So then we are able to use more correct expressions. Then another dimension of correctness is sometimes we use double negatives, which makes our communication unnecessarily roundabout. For example, I do not tell a lie. It's a positive thing communicated through 2 negative things. So we can simply say I'm truthful, I'm honest, I maintain integrity, is it? Sometimes our expressions are incorrect also. For example, again, this is a real example. I crossed my 10 years of teaching. Now, crossed is not used in this context. I have completed 10 years of my teaching. Then another thing which we experience in communication is that we tend to use superlatives in our communication. My biggest strength is, or my biggest weakness is this. We can simply use my key strength is, or my core strength is. So if we become conscious of these niceties, the correctness of our communication improves. Let us come to this factor which we call concreteness. This is a very important dimension of communication because this gives credibility to our communication. What do we mean by concreteness? Our communication should be very specific and definite. One of my favorite example is the warning which is being displayed on cigarette packs. When we used to have warning listed on the cigarette packs, the earlier warning used to be like this, that cigarette smoking is actually injurious to health. So it was a correct expression, it was a clear expression. but it was not a concrete expression. And now this has been replaced by another warning which now goes like this. In fact, now you have visuals also displayed on the cigarette packs to communicate this idea across, that cigarette smoking causes cancer. Now you can make out that the first expression, though clear, though correct, is not that concrete as the second expression, which specifically tells us the harm that cigarette smoking has to our health, isn't it? So this kind of concreteness is very, very important both for oral as also for written communication. In fact, only when we have concreteness in our communication, that makes our communication credible. Credible by that means believable. And then it becomes very conviction based also. So we have to ensure that our communication is concrete. I give you a few examples which will help you appreciate this point. Again, I am sharing with you two sets which I have picked out from my training programs. One says, after retirement, I want to do social service. Again, a very noble expression. Now, another write-up conveys the same idea, but in this form, that post-retirement, I wish to offer free education to poor children of my locality. Both are noble expressions, but you can make out that in the first set, it is only a wishful thing. I want to do social service, but it is not clear in which direction, for example, this effort would be directed, isn't it? But the second set is far more definite, isn't it? So the person in the arena of social service wants to work for education, and in that also the person wishes to focus on the disadvantaged groups in the society, and not society as a whole, but in the particular locality where the person is born or considers as the native place. Likewise, somebody writes, I want to be a good human being. Again, a noble expression. But somebody, when talking about the contributions that the person has made, writes, till date I have helped 500 students get jobs, and I wish to continue these efforts. Now you see, now is there a need for this person to specify that I want to be a good human being? Actually, the very fact that the person has this contribution focus, wants to help others, makes that person a good human being. He need not say it specifically, isn't it? Likewise, I want to reach senior positions in my career. Now, senior position is also fine, but in academic, if the person is part of an academic world and says, I want to become a professor, that is a far, concrete expression than just say that I want to reach to senior positions in my career. Or generally now, this is a very important concern which I am observing, that environmental consciousness has grown. So somebody writes, I want to contribute to saving of environment. Now I met a doctor and in such training programs, and he comes from a small village near Aligarh, and he wrote in that write-up, he said, I wish that each and every house in my village has 2 trees. And in fact, I have already done so in half of my village. I actually visited that village then. So just having a wish that I want to contribute to save environment is a fair expression, but it is not a concrete expression. So you will note that the second set that I have displayed over here is far more definite than the first set. So our communication has to be geared to that eventuality. So we'll take a break we have not covered all the C's. We have talked about 5 C's in this session. We will discuss additional 2 C's that we could not cover in this session, and then we will talk about some general aspects of improving our communication skills, so that at least as a sender of communication, we communicate in a manner that we are able to reach out to the receiver of our communication. Thank you very much. So, my dear participants, this session is going to be a continuation of the previous session that we have had, and we talked about some C's of effective communication, which if we address, we will be able to encounter the barriers in communication, especially as a sender. And once we improve our effectiveness on that account, when in some stage we are receiver of communication, even then this kind of understanding can help us. So we have talked about some C's, like we talked about clarity, we talked about concreteness, we talked about correctness, we talked about completeness, isn't it? So all those things, and we talked about crispness, conciseness also. Now there are some additional C's which has been proposed by Francis, and what are these C's actually? Let us take up them, and then we have some additional points to make. One of the 6th C is what is called consideration. That is designing the message as per audience analysis, isn't it? As we have already discussed, that actually communication is not what we say, communication is what others receive. So a good communicator is one who is able to look at his communication from the audience perspective. For example, I told you about use of technical jargons in our communication. What does that mean? I don't have an idea about the audience profile. So a doctor, who you might have seen some doctors like that, who would use very technical language, and you would not be able to understand about your own ailment if you are consulting them. But there are some doctors who would explain to you in very simple terms. So a communication which is designed as per the profile of the audience, that is the C, what is called consideration. And what does that require? It requires empathy. That is our ability to step into the other person's shoes, isn't it? So I have shared with you my previous experiences of listening to teachers' presentation in HRD center in AMU, and it has been my experience that almost 40% of the teachers, especially from science disciplines, from engineering, from medicine, they end up making very technical presentations, isn't it? So if we have this ability to assess the socio-psychological profile of the receiver, and we are able to tailor our communication, in fact, a very good test which many good speakers have resorted to, that when they are going to talk to an audience, they would first explain those ideas to a kid in the family. If the kid also understands the idea, that means their communication is as per the audience. In fact, we have this example of Nalanda University, whose graduates were mandated to share. In fact, that was the basis of awarding them a degree, that they were supposed to go out of the campus and teach whatever they have learned to a shepherd. So if they are able to explain those ideas to a shepherd, then it would be presumed that their understanding is complete. So actually this C, consideration, has a bearing on other C's also. Then there is this important C of communication which we call courtesy. What is courtesy? Courtesy is we respect the receiver. In transaction analysis, in behavioral area, there is this concept of transaction, and there are ego states which are mentioned. So one of the ego state is when I have this mental orientation that I say I am okay, you are also okay. Somebody who takes a lofty position would say, I am okay, you are not okay. Isn't it? So actually, when the person grows in life, he is likely to become more humble, and that should be reflected in the communication of the person. There is this colloquial expression that a tree which has a lot of fruits actually would, the weight of the fruits would bring it down. We say that फलदार दरख्त जो है झुक जाता है, isn't it? So it is this kind of courtesy we need to observe in our communication. So a good communicator will not take a one-up position. I may be a teacher and I may have this mistaken notion that I am more knowledgeable than my students. So should I reflect that kind of orientation in my classes? And if I speak from that heightened sense of self-importance and taking a one-up position, will my communication be effective? In fact, this one-up position is reflected both in our verbal communication and also in our non-verbal communication, isn't it? So for example, somebody who takes a one-up position may have hands in the pocket as if he can afford that. So our body language also communicates this, isn't it? And then another very important dimension of present day communication is that it has to be inclusive, because now we have lot of diversities. For example, we have gender related diversities, class related diversities. Then there are physically challenged persons. Then people come with different varied ethnic backgrounds. So our communication, which has an inclusive approach, which respects all these diversities and differences, is a courteous communication. Another thing which I have experienced as a teacher, if we are blessed with a good memory and we remember the name of the person with whom we are communicating, then it creates an immediate bonding with the other person. In fact, this was used very effectively by one of the legendary manager of Tata Group called Rusi Modi. There was a legend about him that he remembered names of 40,000 employees of his organization. In fact, some of them were extending even that he would often remember even the names of the family members of those employees. So remembering names, again, this would come about only when we have a genuine interest in the other person with whom we are communicating. I give you an example again which I picked up from those write-ups. Somebody writes like this: I'm a very versatile person and I coordinate effectively between the management and the head of the institution. Now, in the first glance, you find this a bit boastful communication, isn't it? So if we have this heightened sense of self-importance, then our communication becomes discourteous, and we have to be mindful of this aspect. Now, what are other C's which I have discovered as a part of doing these exercises, in addition to those 7 C's and the additional C's which I have been discussing all along? These are some other C's also which we may have to take into account when we are communicating with others. One is maintaining a consistency in our communication. What does that mean? It means that there should be a logical connect. For example, if I say that I'm a hard-working person, isn't it? And that gets reflected in my academic grades, that means I have maintained that consistency. If I say that I am a very time-conscious person, and in my strengths I talk about, let's say, my ability to meet the deadlines, the communication is consistent. And actually it is compatible also, congruent. Then another feature of communication is coherence. because actually it is like having, when we communicate, we have some beads. So how do we make a garland? We make a garland when we have a string through which we are able to bind those beads. So likewise, a good communication is like a good garland. You need a string. So that string creates a connect between ideas. So it should sound as a well structured, organized, logical. So if we are able to maintain that kind of coherence in our communication, then we are doing a good job of communicating. Then yet another factor is being candid about our communication. That is very forthright, not moving around here and there. So it is very difficult to be candid about one's own self, especially, for example, if we are talking about our weaknesses. And I make this candid expression that actually I tend to procrastinate things, and I am not able to stick to time schedules. So it's a candid expression, isn't it? So especially when something which can put you in a tight corner, and even then we state it, we make ourselves vulnerable. That's a candid communication. Then communication, I have already told you, is logic, but it is also emotions. So a communication which has mind and the heart going together, that is a charged communication. So all good communicators make sure that their communication is a mix of logic and emotions. In fact, when these two get clubbed together, our communication sounds convincing. We are more confident when we are able to state our true feelings, isn't it? And such a communication becomes very compelling and persuasive to others, isn't it? Now, having said that, actually, there is this last C, which I consider as a very important C, which is creativity in communication. Yes, we have to be simple, yet we have to evolve a style of our own. Now, it may be very difficult to be creative when we do not have a very sound language base. Only when we develop a good language base, we are able to use language effectively. I give you an example which I recently experienced when I was conducting these sessions. There was a boy who was pursuing his PhD in nanotechnology, and at that point of time, earlier when he was a student of graduate programs and postgraduate programs, his extracurricular activity was that he was a horse rider. But ever since he got into this demanding course of PhD, he quit that hobby. So he wanted to talk about that. So he wrote an expression. He said, after I joined my PhD, I took a jump from horse riding. Now I found that expression very creative. In horse riding, we use jump in a particular way, but the fellow was able to use that simple word in a very creative fashion. So if we are able to use our language in such a way, that would be a fantastic communication and creative communication. So once we develop language competence, we are able to use such creative expressions in our communication, and then we gradually evolve a style of our own. Now, over the years, I have also been able to find out or discover some C's of ineffective communication also, which are converse of what we have been talking about. Like, for example, if our communication is very callous, very heartless, that means we don't have any concern for the feeling of the receiver, then that communication would be callous. Then another version of it would be casual, careless communication. And this is not only reflected in our verbal communication. I often get the assignments from the students. Some students would submit it in a very neat packed manner, isn't it? They would have a proper file in which they would submit it. Some would just tear a sheet and then scribble on it. In fact, there would be even cuttings in that, and they would submit it. So it's a very casual and careless communication, actually, isn't it? Then I've already told you about roundabout communication, double negatives, for example. I do not like. So sometimes our communication is unnecessarily twisted, coiled, convoluted, isn't it? And such communication often gets complex. I shared with you the example of complex communication also. The other person is not able to understand, maybe because of the technical words, or there is ambiguity at the idea level also. Then I talked about the consistent communication. The reverse of it could be contradictory communication. I say I am a very hardworking person, and all through my life I have been a third divisioner or a second divisioner. So if my hard work is not getting reflected in my academics, and I am primarily a student, so will my communication stick? Not really, isn't it? Then this complicated, confusing, intricate, all that actually emanates from the ideas. And if we are able to clarify our ideas, then we will not have this problem. Clumsy is actually linked with the earlier points of casual and careless communication. Something which is not elegant, is it? And the worst form of ineffective communication is when it is conceited. We don't say what we mean, or what we say we do not mean it, is it? And sometimes this gets reflected as a kind of superiority complex that we may reflect. We may become boastful. We have shared that example also with you earlier. So we have to be conscious of these ineffective C's of communication. So now let me conclude this discussion with a powerful idea that has been coined by Aristotle when he wrote Rhetoric. That is one of his magnum opus. And there he talked about some simple ideas which are the hallmark of any persuasive communication. And he said, actually, for persuasive communication, we need three things: logos, pathos, and ethos. I have already talked about pathos and ethos in my earlier sessions. Pathos refers to the emotional appeal. Ethos refers to the ethics of the person, the character of the person, the credibility of the person. Is the person demonstrating the required integrity? Is the person demonstrating required expertise? So, for example, if we go to a doctor and doctor gives us enough evidence of, let us say, the prescriptions that he is proposing, so that's an expertise. But if we also have this record that this doctor has treated so many patients for this particular disease, isn't it? So there is a credibility attached with that person. So all communication actually is based on the character of the communicator. If we have trust and faith in the communicator, the receiver would actually buy that idea. Then the language which we have developed actually makes our communication logical, isn't it? So language is a skill which makes our communication logical. There should be logic in the ideas also, but the language should also be very consistent, as I said earlier, isn't it? So when we are able to convince our recipient with the use of reason, facts, and then we are able to link those ideas through effective use of the language. There will be the third dimension also in our communication. So actually we need all these three things together to communicate effectively, that is logos, pathos and ethos. I share with you this sample which I find as a very effective communication. And this is a letter which has been written by Abraham Lincoln, the former President of America. And he wrote this to his son's headmaster. And this is one of the most effective communication I have come across. It has all those elements, the C's which I was talking about. So the letter goes like this, that he will have to learn, I know, that all men are not just, all men are not true, but teach him that for every scoundrel there is a hero, that for every selfish politician there is a dedicated leader. Teach him also that for every enemy there is a friend. It will take time, I know, but teach him, if you can, that $1 earned is of far more value than 5 pounds. Teach him to learn to lose and also enjoy winning. Teach him the secret of quiet laughter. Teach him, if you can, the wonder of the books, but also give him time to ponder over the eternal mystery of the birds in the sky, bees in the sun, and the flowers on the green hillside. In school, teach him it is far more honorable to fail than to cheat. Teach him to have faith in his own ideas, even if everyone tells him that they are wrong. Teach him to be gentle with gentle people and tough with the tough. Try to give my son the strength not to follow the crowd when everybody is getting on the bandwagon. Teach him to listen to all, but teach him to filter all that he hears on the screen of truth and take only the good that comes through. Teach him, if you can, how to laugh when he is sad. Teach him that there is no shame in tears. Teach him to ignore cynics and beware of too much of sweetness. Teach him to sell his talents to the highest bidder, but never to put a price tag on his soul. Teach him to close his ears to the shouting mob and to stand and fight if he thinks he is right. Treat him gently, but do not cuddle him, because only the test of fire makes a fine steel. Let him have the courage to be impatient. Let him have the patience to be brave. Teach him always to have sublime faith in the mankind, because then only he will have sublime faith in himself. This is a big order, I know, but see what you can do. He is such a fine little fellow. So you will note that none of the words that have been used in this are difficult. Yet the ideas are so profound. In fact, whenever I have narrated it, I incidentally narrated it to one of my teachers who was visually challenged. And after each sentence, he would ask me to stop so that he can absorb that sentence and reflect on it. Such is the power of effective communication. And it is my wish that we grow into such communicator, then all those barriers which we have talked about will vanish. So let me now conclude this discussion. How can we become effective communicators and address the barriers that we are likely to encounter? Actually, life is a process of moving on that pyramid which I talked about. From information, we move to knowledge, and finally, we gain wisdom about the world around us. So if we grow in that manner, that is the core thing. And at that wisdom level, our ideas are very simple. Then Yes, we need not only an idea, but we also need an expression. So we have to develop our language skills. And there are, 4 language skills that are there. In fact, this is how we pick up a language. First, we listen to others, isn't it? Then, when we go to school, we are asked to read and speak. So, when we listen, we pick up the ability to speak also. When we read, we develop an ability to write also. So, our language skills, if they are developed on all these 4 accounts, we become effective communicator. So, you will note that actually becoming an effective communicator is not just a skill, it is actually a life skill. In fact, it is the process of maturing as a person. Isn't it? So, whatever ideas I have shared with you, if we make use of these ideas, we will be able to address various barriers that we have discussed. And you may recall that most of the barriers that we have discussed were related to the psychological barriers, the perception related barriers, or some of the barriers were related to emotions, isn't it? So if we are able to use the ideas that have been shared by thinkers like Aristotle, who talked about those 3 core things which are important for persuasive communication: the logos, the pathos, and the ethos. And when you think about your own communication skills, read and reread this letter of Abraham Lincoln. And I'm sure if we are able to graduate to this level, then I think we will be able to do justice with our communication. Thank you very much.